Hello and welcome to our chemistry review video number 2. We're going to talk about chemical reactions and organic molecules. The main take-home concepts from this video are going to include understanding the terms monomer and polymer, knowing the difference between chemical reactions that would be considered hydrolysis reactions and those that would be considered condensation or dehydration reactions. Understanding why carbon atoms are the core building blocks of organic molecules. And finally, knowing the 4 different categories of organic molecules. And not only knowing what they are, but being able to match the basic building block or building pieces with the more complex structures that can be formed from those building blocks. Alright, so if we're talking about going from individual atoms which can bond to each other to large complex structures that can make up cells, we need to talk about how these atoms are being built up into these larger structures. So we could start off by taking one atom and linking it to another atom and then undergoing a chemical reaction to bond that to another atom and so on and so forth until you have a million atoms linked together into this complex. Sort of like, you start out with one stitch and a million stitches later you end up with an Afghan, but that's not really how our body builds structures. Instead, there are discrete building blocks, these complexes of atoms that serve as pieces that can be assembled into larger structures. So these building blocks can be built up into a variety of different larger structures, and then we can disassemble those structures and reuse the building blocks to create other types of structures. And in this way, we're really more like a Lego house than a Afghan. Now, the basic building blocks that are used as the components to make up our larger structures are referred to as monomers. Mono meaning one, mer meaning piece. We then call the larger structures that we make out of our monomers the polymers. Poly meaning many, so this literally means many pieces. The chemical reactions that connect monomers together into polymers start out by taking a monomer and removing elements from both the monomer and the other monomer or the short polymer that you want to connect it to. So we remove 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, and this becomes a water molecule. And then the atoms making up those monomers, since we removed some of the atoms that they were bound to, we now need to rearrange the chemical bonds so that everything now has a full valence shell again. And this is going to cause the single monomer to be covalently linked to our short polymer. Now, this type of reaction where we're taking small pieces and building them up into larger pieces is often called a dehydration reaction because we're pulling out a water molecule's worth of elements from the individual pieces. Sometimes it's also referred to as a dehydration synthesis reaction, referring to the fact that this synthesizes something or makes something larger. Some textbooks will also refer to this type of reaction as a condensation reaction, again referring to the water molecule being pulled out and created during this type of reaction. All of these things are referring to the same type of reaction, the linking of individual building blocks together to make larger structures. The reverse reaction can also take place. So water molecules are split apart and the components are then rearranged and the bonds between elements are rearranged so that the monomer is now pulled off from the larger structure. And this is called a hydrolysis reaction. Hydro meaning water, lysis meaning to break or to rupture. So we're actually breaking apart a larger structure into smaller pieces in this type of reaction. And in our bodies, we have this constant state of breaking down things and taking the pieces and building up new things. So every time you eat a hamburger, you're going to break down the organic molecules of that hamburger into building blocks which you can then reuse to build up your own muscles or your own cellular components. So there's this constant movement of small pieces being built up into large pieces and large structures being broken down into small pieces. So this dehydration reaction, hydrolysis reaction is constantly going on inside of our bodies and inside of our cells, and this is what makes up the metabolism that keeps us alive. Now, when we're looking at this picture, it's not intuitively obvious that these purple balls don't represent a single atom, but actually a larger complex of atoms. So let's look at a slightly more detailed image of this same thing. So in this case, purple ball is replaced with sugar molecule. So a sugar molecule is a type of monomer, a single building block piece. And they're being shown here, two sugar monomers being connected together into a larger structure or broken down back into single individual monomers, depending on whether you're going in the direction of the dehydration reaction or the hydrolysis reaction. So each sugar molecule contains about 24 individual atoms, and that would be the building block or the monomer for a larger structure. The other thing that this shows well is that you need more than just one oxygen and two hydrogens. You can see where this reaction is taking place, there are two OH groups, and one of the oxygens is staying behind, and that's what's forming the bond between the two monomers. So oxygen is fairly electronegative, so it forms bonds that are fairly polar in nature. So if you're going to have a point where you're going to break apart monomers and re-establish a bond there, and you have this sort of constant building up and breaking down, we're going to use the slightly weaker polar bonds as the point where this breaking apart and building back up are going to happen, as opposed to trying to break apart and reestablish bonds between carbons, which has a very nonpolar aspect to it. Alright, so let's talk about organic molecules. Your book defines organic compounds as molecules containing carbon and hydrogen atoms. That's sort of the basic two elements that they have to have. As in the previous video we talked about, 96% of organic matter is made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So you have to have at least carbon and hydrogen to get that sort of organic compound qualification. Organic compounds are called organic because they're usually associated with organisms. So these are going to be compounds that are synthesized by cells, because cells have very complex biochemical properties and lots of enzymes which catalyze these reactions. So you can create large complex molecules with millions of individual atoms associated with it. And that's not something you see happening spontaneously in nature. It's something you see happening in living organisms where energy is being put in to build them up. So it's not uncommon for these to be very large and very complex molecules. And some organic molecules are small and to some degree fairly simple, but you can also have organic molecules that are millions of atoms in size and very complex. And another important aspect about organic molecules is that they are all based on a carbon skeleton. So we said they're made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms. The carbon is serving as the scaffolding around which other atoms are attached. So if you've heard the phrase carbon-based life, that's what that's referring to. And carbon has a very important characteristic that makes it essential for this type of building, and that's that it is tetravalent. So tetra meaning four, valent referring to that valence shell. A tetravalent atom, like carbon, is going to have 4 open spaces in its valence shell. So carbon has 4 electrons in a valence shell that will hold 8. So it generally shares all 4 of its electrons with other atoms in exchange for them sharing 4 additional electrons with it to get the 8 electrons that it needs. Now when you have a flat representation of a carbon-based molecule, it's not obvious why that's important. But when you look at an element in 3D, being able to make bonds in 4 places is the minimum number of bonds you need to get a 3-dimensional structure. So if we look at bonding number with depth of structure, you have, of course, the inert gases, which cannot make bonds with anything. So you have individual atoms that don't interact with anything at all. You also have things like hydrogen, which can make 1 bond, so share 1 electron and receive 1 electron to fill up the valence shell, so then you can get little 2-atom units like molecular hydrogen. You really start to get a single dimension forming once you have atoms that can make at least 2 bonds. So this is going to allow you to create a string of atoms, so a line, but again you really only have 1 dimension there. To get a 2D molecule, you really need at least 3 bonds, and this is going to create a plane, so a very flat molecule, but it has height and width, so we have 2 dimensions there. And again, as I said before, if you want a 3-dimensional object, you need 4 bonding sites. So here we have something that can make 4 bonds, and now we have something that has height, it has length, and now depth to it. So a 3-dimensional structure. And because carbon can create very stable nonpolar bonds in very complex 3-dimensional shapes, you can get a huge variety and nearly limitless different number of structures being built. So these are all models of molecules where the black atoms are representing where the carbons are. So you can see how the carbon skeleton can have other elements added into it, but really the carbons themselves serve as the major building block component. So all of these would be considered organic molecules because they're based around the carbon atoms in black and the hydrogen atoms then shown in gray. So when we talk about the organic molecules that make up cells, cellular components and the organic molecules that make up cellular components can be split into 4 different categories of organic molecules. The first category are the carbohydrates. The basic building block for carbohydrates are the monomers, which are sugars, or sometimes they are referred to as monosaccharides. Individual sugars can be linked together into more complex structures, and many sugars linked together into a complex carbohydrate is referred to as a polysaccharide. Another category of organic molecules are the lipids. And lipid is sort of a catch-all category for different types of molecules that are non-polar and do not dissolve well in water. They don't really polymerize the way all of the other categories of organic molecules do, but the basic building block that we are going to discuss in the most depth will be the fatty acid. And you can have individual fatty acids being linked together into larger structures such as fats or phospholipids, which we'll discuss more in class. Another important category of organic molecules are the proteins. Proteins are made up of the building blocks called amino acids. Amino acids then can polymerize into the larger structures, which are often referred to either as proteins or polypeptides. And finally, we have nucleic acids. So the individual monomers are called nucleotides. Nucleotides can be polymerized into extremely large molecules. Nucleic acids are some of the biggest polymers found inside cells. And so nucleic acids in cells generally fall into 2 different types. There are the ribonucleic acids, which are the smaller structures, RNA, and the much larger structures, the deoxyribonucleic acids, or DNA, that holds the genetic information of the cell. So these are the 4 different types of organic molecules that make up all cells, whether it's a human cell or an elephant cell or a tree cell or a bacterial cell. And so understanding these 4 different categories of organic molecules will let you understand how all different types of cells are built up and created.